Nathan Redfield had only recently graduated from the FBI Academy in Quantico, December 1980, to be exact, ranking in the top third of his class. At 26, he was young, confident, and eager to prove himself. Born and raised in Queens, New York, Nathan was the son of a retired postal worker and a Mohawk mother whose quiet strength deeply shaped his character. When he received his credentials, his father gave him an old wristwatch he had worn through 4 decades of federal service and offered only 6 words. "Use your time wisely, son." The Bureau's usual protocol for rookies involved months of shadowing veteran agents. Nathan had expected a long initiation period at the Manhattan field office, mostly behind a desk. But just 2 months in, he was summoned to Assistant Director Howard Loomis's office. Loomis was an old-school lawman, stern but measured. After a brief exchange about Nathan's adjustment to the job, the director abruptly closed the agent's personnel file and asked a question Nathan wasn't expecting. "You think you're ready for an assignment, Redfield?" It caught Nathan off guard, but with the weight of ambition on his shoulders, he nodded and said yes. Loomis didn't smile. He leaned back and explained the situation. There was trouble in upstate New York in a place called Scawanati Territory, Mohawk land, that straddled the U.S.-Canada border. It was a jurisdictional maze. State police had no authority there. Tribal police handled most matters, but in cases of murder or serious federal crime, they could call in the FBI. The problem was, Scawanati hadn't done that in over 10 years, not since the Bureau's failure to properly investigate the 1966 disappearance of a Mohawk teenager named Harper Clearwater. Locals had always believed she was abducted. The Bureau had written her off as a runaway. It created a rift that never healed. Now something new and much darker had happened. An 11-year-old girl from Quebec had been found wandering barefoot, soaked in blood, near a small farm at the break of dawn. Strangely, the blood wasn't hers. Later that day, 5 mutilated bodies were discovered along the Scawanati River. The crime was brutal, ritualistic, and full of unanswered questions. Loomis looked at Nathan carefully. "They don't trust us anymore," he said, "but maybe they'll trust you. You're not just an agent, you're one of theirs in part. That matters out there." Nathan was assigned the case not because of his investigative experience, but because of his identity, his cultural link to the land and its people. He would be the Bureau's face in a place that had long closed its doors to federal agents. The next morning, he packed his bags and drove north for nearly 7 hours through steady snowfall. As the miles passed and the pine forests thickened, he realized this was no ordinary case. What waited in Scawanati wasn't just a crime scene, it was a reckoning long in the making. Nathan Redfield's first impression of Stone Hollow was a far cry from the bustling streets of Manhattan. As he drove north from Queens, the skyline faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by miles of dense, snow-covered forests and the occasional small town, nearly forgotten by time. The roads were narrow, flanked by towering pines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. As he neared the Scawanati territory, a sense of isolation began to settle in. It wasn't just the quiet of the place. It was the feeling that here people lived by their own rules, outside the reach of the modern world he knew so well. The quaint, ramshackle buildings of Stone Hollow, the largest town on the Reservations' American side, were tucked into the shadow of the forest, with only a handful of cars parked along the main street. The landscape, so different from the concrete jungle he was used to, felt foreign, alien even. His first meeting was with Chief Elias Bearclaw, the head of the tribal police. The chief had arranged to meet Nathan at a local diner, the Bear's Den, a modest establishment known for its hearty meals and rich local flavor. As Nathan stepped inside, the warmth of the fire crackling in the corner contrasted sharply with the cold outside, but it was the sense of history in the air that caught his attention. The old photos on the walls, the muted murmurs of locals discussing the day's news, it all felt like a world apart. Chief Bearclaw, A tall, weathered man with piercing eyes was already sitting at a booth nursing a cup of black coffee. He didn't offer a handshake, just a nod, as though acknowledging that Nathan, despite his badge and new title, was still an outsider. "Welcome to Skawanati," the chief said, his voice low but commanding. "This place, it's different than what you're used to. You're not just an agent here, you're a guest. But more than that, you're a link to something the people here have long felt was lost." Nathan was still processing his previous conversation with Loomis, the sense that he wasn't just being sent to investigate a case, but to bridge a gap. He wasn't sure what Loomis meant by link, but here, face to face with the chief, he was starting to understand. Nathan's Mohawk heritage, something he'd always seen as just part of his identity, was suddenly being thrust into the spotlight. For the first time, it felt like more than just a connection to his family. It was a key to unlocking trust in a place where the FBI had failed time and time again. As they spoke, the chief began to explain the tension that ran like an undercurrent through the reservation, especially when it came to the law. Tribal police were sworn to protect the land and its people, but their authority didn't extend beyond the borders of the reservation. And for the past decade, the FBI hadn't been a welcome presence here. The last time the Bureau had been called in was over a decade ago during the disappearance of Harper Clearwater, a local girl who'd vanished under mysterious circumstances. While the Bureau had declared Harper a runaway, the people here believed she had been abducted by someone or something. That belief had never faded, and neither had the distrust toward the FBI. Nathan's mind was racing as Chief Bearclaw continued. The mention of Harper, the unsolved case that had haunted the community for years, was never far from Nathan's thoughts. He could sense the weight of that history pressing down on him. A reminder that, whatever lay ahead, his success would depend not only on solving the current mystery, but also on repairing a bridge that had been broken long before he arrived. "I don't expect you to solve everything," Redfield, the chief said, breaking Nathan's reverie, "but I do expect you to understand that what you're walking into is more than just a case. This is about trust. The people here need to know you're here for the right reasons." Nathan nodded, the magnitude of his task settling in. The FBI had failed them once before, and now it was up to him to prove that the Bureau could be a force for good, not just for justice, but for healing the wounds of the past. The chief's words echoed in his mind as they finished their meal and as Nathan made his way back to his motel room. Later that night, he felt the weight of the responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders. Skawanati wasn't just a place on the map. It was a test, one that would challenge everything Nathan thought he knew about law, loyalty, and justice. Nathan Redfield's first full day in Stone Hollow was a cold, biting reminder that he wasn't in the city anymore. The snow had begun to fall heavily overnight, and by morning it blanketed the small town in a thick, silent layer muffling the usual sounds of life. The roads were slick, winding through the dense forest like a maze. The town itself was still eerily still. Not a single car drove down the main street as Nathan made his way toward the tribal police precinct. The chief, Elias Bearclaw, had warned him that things were different here, that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed, and Nathan was beginning to feel the truth of those words pressing in. After his breakfast at the Bear's Den, he met with the chief again, this time in the office. The walls were lined with old photos, black and white images of Mohawk ancestors, faded relics of a past that seemed to stand in stark contrast to the modern world Nathan had left behind in New York. The police station was small, nothing more than a converted building that looked like it had been pieced together over generations. There was a certain feeling of in-betweenness, a sense that the reservation straddled not just two countries, but two worlds entirely, one grounded in the history of the Mohawk people, the other governed by modern American law. Bearclaw was sitting behind a desk, and when Nathan entered, he didn't greet him with the usual handshake. Instead, the chief motioned for Nathan to sit, then slid a file across the desk. It was thick, worn at the edges, and the paper had the yellowed texture of something that had been handled far too many times. The Harper Clearwater case file sat before Nathan, like an anchor, reminding him of the unresolved pain the community still carried. "This is what you're dealing with, Redfield," the chief said, his tone grave. "Back in '66, Harper disappeared. We called for help. Your people didn't listen. And after you closed the case, we didn't hear from the FBI again for a decade. We've been cleaning up the mess ever since. That's why it's important you understand there's more here than just solving a crime. The people have memories. They carry them like burdens." Nathan swallowed, his mind racing as he flipped through the case file. The details were sparse. A 17-year-old girl gone missing, last seen leaving her home near the river. The FBI's investigation had been brief, concluding that she had run away, just another troubled teenager trying to escape. But the people on the reservation, especially the tribal police, had always believed something darker was at play. The chief's words lingered in Nathan's thoughts as he scanned through the file. "You're the face of this thing now. Don't forget it." He couldn't shake the weight of the responsibility. Harper Clearwater's disappearance had cast a shadow over the reservation for years, and Nathan's involvement was seen as a necessary step in trying to repair a fragile relationship between the FBI and the Mohawk community. But what did that even mean? How could he prove the Bureau's worth after so many years of mistrust? Before he could answer those questions, the chief leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "We got a call this morning. Redfield, a farmer found a girl, 11 years old, covered in blood, but none of it was hers. She said she came from the river." That's where it all started. The blood, the bodies, the mystery. Nathan's heart skipped a beat as the chief continued to explain the situation. The girl had been walking barefoot through the snow, and when she collapsed in front of the farmer's house, she barely had the strength to speak. She told him that she'd been walking for miles, 3 to be exact, through the forest and the cold, before finally passing out. The farmer had rushed her to the local medical clinic where they stabilized her, but there was no sign of what had happened to her. No wounds, no explanation. The only thing she could say before losing consciousness was, "I came from the river." Nathan's mind spun as the chief recounted the next part of the discovery. The bodies of 5 men were found not far from the riverbank, their intestines hanging from trees, their bodies grotesquely mutilated. The chief didn't need to explain how bizarre the scene was. Nathan knew it had to be something horrific. But what was more chilling was the tribal belief that surrounded it. According to local folklore, there were stories of river spirits, beings who could either protect or destroy depending on how they were approached. The chief wasn't willing to commit to anything supernatural, but he didn't shy away from the fact that many people on the reservation believed the spirit of the river had come to avenge something. As Nathan processed this, the chief gave him one final piece of information: the river spirits weren't just myths to the people of Skawanati. They were a part of the culture woven into the land, the stories, the very fabric of the Mohawk identity. For Nathan, this wasn't just an investigation. It was a cultural minefield. In many ways, this case wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about understanding the deep mistrust that existed between the FBI and the Mohawk people. Nathan stood up, feeling the weight of his task press harder on his shoulders. The FBI's past failures had already complicated things. But now, with the girl, the bodies, and the looming legend of the river spirits, the stakes had never felt higher. He was no longer just an agent. He was now the bridge between two worlds, the law enforcement world he knew, and the one that had shaped the Mohawk community's past. The first step was to understand the land, the people, and the stories they carried. And Nathan realized, as he stepped back into the cold morning air, that this was only the beginning. The day after Nathan's meeting with Chief Elias Bearclaw, the investigation took a chilling turn. The strange and unsettling discovery of the bodies along the riverbank weighed heavily on Nathan's mind as he stood at the edge of the Skawanati River. The water was cold and swift, running dark with the remnants of the snowmelt that had just started to recede. As he looked out over the river, it was easy to imagine how it might have been a lifeline for the people here. how it might have once been a place of sustenance and community. But now, it felt like a dividing line, one that separated more than just land, but two different worlds, each carrying its own truths, its own pains. The chief had led Nathan to the site where the bodies had been discovered. The trees here were thick and ancient, casting long shadows even in the daylight, making the entire scene feel even more foreboding. The bodies of 5 men, their faces twisted in silent screams, hung from the branches like grotesque puppets. Their entrails, severed and suspended in unnatural positions, dangled in the air. Ritualistic mutilation was not unheard of in cases of organized crime, but the manner in which these bodies had been displayed was unsettling. The community's belief in the river spirits began to feel less like myth and more like something to be reckoned with. Nathan stood in silence, his hands tucked deep into his coat pockets, trying to process the scene before him. The idea that something supernatural could have caused this something tied to the spirits of the river gnawed at him. He'd always prided himself on his analytical mind, on approaching cases with cold, hard facts. But the strange occurrences surrounding this case, the girl who appeared out of nowhere covered in blood yet unharmed, and now these bodies with their peculiar arrangement, challenged everything he thought he knew. It was as if the boundaries between reality and folklore were beginning to blur, and Nathan wasn't sure which side of the line he stood on anymore. "Tell me what you think happened here, Keith." Bearclaw's voice broke through Nathan's reverie. The chief had been quiet, letting Nathan absorb the scene, but now the weight of responsibility had shifted back onto Nathan's shoulders. This wasn't just about investigating a crime, it was about uncovering the truth behind a fractured community, one that carried decades of pain and mistrust. The FBI's past failures had left a hole between the reservation and federal law enforcement that couldn't be easily fixed, and Nathan knew this investigation would either help heal that wound or drive the gap even deeper. Nathan exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air, and turned toward the chief. "These men were killed." Nathan said the words, tasting bitter on his tongue. But this wasn't just about murder. Whoever did this wanted to make a statement, and I don't think it was just about revenge. There's something else here, something bigger. The chief nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "That's what we thought too. There's a story among the elders here about the spirit of the river, who comes to protect the land and its people. It's said to be a guardian, and those who defile the land, well, they're punished." Nathan raised an eyebrow, skeptical but intrigued. "A guardian?" he asked. "So, you're telling me that the spirit of the river killed these men?" The chief didn't answer immediately, but his gaze drifted toward the river. "I'm not telling you what to believe, Redfield, but out here there are things that can't be explained. There are stories, traditions that have been passed down for generations. They mean something to the people here." Nathan felt a chill creep up his spine. It wasn't just the cold air. It was the unsettling sense that there were layers to this case he hadn't yet begun to uncover. He had always been skeptical of supernatural explanations, preferring instead to focus on the hard facts, blood fingerprints, motives. But this place was different. The community's deep connection to the land and their beliefs about the river spirits weren't easily dismissed, even if Nathan struggled to understand them. The more time he spent here, the more he realized that in order to solve the crime, he would need to bridge that gap between fact and belief. That night, as Nathan sat alone in his motel room, the case file spread out before him. He couldn't shake the feeling of unease that seemed to grow with each passing hour. He couldn't help but think about Sarah Du Bois, the young girl who had been found near the farm. She was the only surviving witness to the events that had unfolded along the river. But when he thought about her, he saw something in her eyes, something that told him she knew more than she was letting on. She had said she came from the river, but what did that really mean? And why had she been spared when the others had been brutally killed? The next morning, he visited Sarah at the local medical clinic. She was in a fragile state, tired, disoriented, and reluctant to speak. Nathan had hoped she might offer some kind of clue, something that would help piece together the mystery. but she was locked in her silence, her mind seemingly far from the present moment. When she finally spoke, her words were barely a whisper. The river? It took them. It took them because they were wrong. They were bad. The chief's words echoed in Nathan's mind. The river takes what it needs. But did it? Or was there something else at play? Something more human than supernatural? Was this a vendetta, a drug deal gone wrong, or a deliberate act of violence rooted in something even darker? As the investigation deepened, Nathan knew he was no closer to understanding the full picture. But one thing was clear. The case was becoming more than just a murder investigation. It was a quest for truth, one that would demand not only his skills as an agent, but his understanding of a culture and a history that stretched far beyond the walls of the FBI. As the days passed, Nathan's time in Stone Hollow became increasingly suffocating. The sense of isolation wasn't just geographic, it was cultural, emotional, and now deeply personal. Nathan had come to solve a crime, but he was beginning to realize that this was about much more than finding the culprits behind the grisly murders. This was about earning the trust of a community that had suffered betrayal and neglect for decades. The skepticism and mistrust that had built up between the reservation and the FBI wasn't something that could be erased overnight. Nathan couldn't just rely on his investigative skills. He needed to prove that he understood the people and the land he was investigating. In the days following his unsettling conversation with Chief Bearclaw, Nathan decided to visit Jonas Clearwater, the father of the missing Harper. Clearwater, the girl whose case had haunted the reservation since 1966. The chief had given Nathan a wary warning about the elderly man, urging him to proceed cautiously. Jonas was known to be a stubborn man, one who had spent years in quiet isolation researching the cross-border smuggling operations that had plagued Scawanati territory. It seemed that Harper's disappearance wasn't just a personal tragedy for Jonas. It had sparked an obsession with uncovering the criminal networks operating right under the reservation's nose. Nathan drove out to the edge of town, where the Clearwater family homestead was nestled among the trees. It was a modest property far removed from the other homes in the area, and Jonas was a man as weathered as the house itself. His face was a patchwork of old scars, both physical and emotional. A World War II veteran, he had lived alone since his wife passed away, with only the memory of his daughter to keep him company. When Nathan knocked on the door, Jonas answered with a cane in one hand and a shotgun in the other. Clearly a man who wasn't willing to take chances, even in his own home. Jonas didn't offer Nathan a seat, but he didn't send him away either. Instead, he gestured for him to stand by the door. "You want to talk about Harper?" Jonas said, his voice rough like gravel. "You think you're the first FBI agent to show up here with that same tired story?" Nathan nodded, recognizing the skepticism in Jonas's voice, but undeterred. "I'm here to find out what happened, and I'm here to listen, not just to investigate." Jonas studied him for a long moment before lowering the shotgun and leaning on his cane. "You're the first agent to say that," he muttered, stepping aside to allow Nathan inside. The cabin was simple furniture, worn down by time, a wood stove in the corner, and a collection of maps and notebooks scattered across a table. As Nathan sat down, Jonas handed him a faded photograph of Harper Clearwater, a young girl with a bright smile and determined eyes. She looked so much like her father, but the picture was bittersweet, frozen in time. "She wasn't a runaway," Jonas said, flatly, his eyes narrowing. "I've known that from the start. He paused as if gathering his thoughts. "They told me she was. They told me the same story over and over again. But that wasn't the truth." Nathan didn't interrupt. He knew better than to press too hard, too soon. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them, allowing Jonas to speak when he was ready. Jonas continued, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were speaking to the picture in his hand, rather than Nathan. "I've been tracking the same people who took Harper. They've been crossing back and forth across the border, smuggling drugs, weapons, and people. The law doesn't touch them. Hell, the border itself barely exists to them. They knew they could take Harper, and no one would do a damn thing about it. Nathan leaned forward, intrigued. This was the first time he had heard this perspective. He had assumed that the disappearance was just another case of a troubled teenager running away. But Jonas was telling him something different. It was personal for the Clearwater family, and it was tied to the larger criminal operations that were feeding off the land, the people, and the porous border between Canada and the United States. "I know it's them," Jonas said, looking up. "But I don't have proof. I've been trying to make sense of it all to find some connection, some pattern. But they've covered their tracks well." Jonas's eyes were filled with a fierce determination. And for the first time, Nathan saw the weight of years spent in silence, driven by a father's grief and a thirst for justice. It was clear that this was not just about bringing Harper home. It was about revenge, about righting a wrong that the FBI had long ignored. "I can help you, Jonas," Nathan said slowly, carefully. "But I need to know everything you've got. Anything you think could tie these people together." "Whatever you have," Jonas nodded, his lips curling into a faint, bitter smile. "You'll get it. But know this, Redfield. These men, these smugglers, they don't care about the law. They don't care about the truth. And if you're going to stop them, you better be ready to face things that the law can't touch." As Nathan left Jonas's cabin, the weight of those words hung heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't just investigating a string of murders or a missing girl anymore. He was wading into a network of cross-border crime, corruption, and revenge. And as he drove back into the heart of Stone Hollow, he couldn't help but wonder, was this going to be just another case for the Bureau? Or something much more, something personal? As Nathan sat across from Officer Wynn, he couldn't shake the growing feeling that something was off. Wynn had been one of the first officers Nathan met when he arrived in Stone Hollow. But now, after the discovery of the mutilated bodies, he found himself questioning everything. Wynn seemed like a competent officer, dedicated to his work. But the strange tip he had received about his involvement left Nathan uneasy. He had hoped it was just a misunderstanding, but the more he thought about it, the less convinced he was. The idea that Wynn, a man who had lived in the community for so long and had even been involved with Harper Clearwater, might be connected to the murders unsettled him deeply. Wynn had been part of the tribal police for years, and while Nathan had initially respected his experience, now he wasn't so sure. As a fellow lawman, Wynn would have known what was at stake in the investigation, but the rumors about his involvement were hard to ignore. Jonas Clearwater. Harper's father had even implied that Wynn might be hiding something, and the possibility that Wynn's personal history with Harper could cloud his judgment made everything even more complicated. The weight of the situation was pressing on Nathan's chest as he waited for Wynn to arrive at the tribal police precinct for their meeting. The building, once a place of law and order, now felt more like a relic of a community that had been betrayed time and time again. The events of the past few days, the discovery of the bodies, the strange circumstances surrounding Sarah DuBois, and the rumors about Wynn had created a cloud of uncertainty that hung over Nathan. The more he tried to piece together the details of the case, the more he realized that solving the murders was only part of the battle. He had to understand the deeper layers of distrust, pain, and unresolved grief that had been building in the community for decades. When Wynn finally walked into the office, his expression was unreadable. Nathan could tell that the officer was nervous, but it was hard to tell if it was because of the investigation or the weight of his own past. Wynn took a seat without speaking, the tension palpable. Nathan knew that this conversation would be crucial, not only for the investigation, but also for understanding where Wynn stood in the larger picture of the case. "I heard some things about that night." Nathan began, his voice steady. "I need you to tell me what happened. All of it." Wynn shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting to the file on the desk. He didn't speak immediately, and for a moment, the room was silent. Nathan could feel the unease building, the weight of the questions pressing on both of them. Finally, Wynn spoke, his voice quiet. "I didn't know what I was walking into," he said, his eyes avoiding Nathan's. "I was just doing my job. I'd been investigating a lead on illegal stills in the area when I found the bodies. I didn't recognize them at first, but when I saw what had been done to them, it was too late by then. I didn't know who they were or what they were involved in. Nathan listened carefully, watching Wynn's every move. He had heard stories of cross-border criminal activity, but hearing it from Wynn himself added a new layer of complexity to the investigation. If Wynn was telling the truth, he had stumbled upon something far darker than he had anticipated. But why had he remained so quiet about it? Why hadn't he come forward sooner? The more Nathan thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. Wynn had been present at the scene, yet his actions afterward were vague at best. And why had he not told anyone about the illegal activity he had uncovered? Was he involved, or was he just trying to cover his tracks? I didn't know what to do. Wynn continued, his voice tinged with frustration. The situation was out of control, and I didn't think anyone would believe me. It all happened so fast, and I was scared. But I swear to you, I never meant for any of this to happen. Nathan studied Wynn's face. There was a mix of regret and guilt, but it was hard to say if it was genuine or a man trying to avoid responsibility. The complexities of Wynn's past with Harper Clearwater, the apparent smuggling operations, and his presence at the scene were starting to paint a picture that was far less clear than Nathan had hoped. I need to know who you were really working with, Wynn. Nathan said, his voice sharper now. I need to understand what happened, and I need to know the truth. Lives are at stake. Wynn fell silent, his face hardening as he looked out the window. It was clear he wasn't ready to share everything, but Nathan wasn't going to back down. Not now, not with so much at stake. The more he learned about the inner workings of the reservation and the people involved, the more it became clear that this case was about much more than a group of murderers. This was about loyalties, betrayals, and the consequences of silence. The revelation that Officer Wynn had been in the vicinity of the Scawanati River murders was only the first crack in the case's complex web. Nathan's mind churned with questions. What did Wynn know? What role had he played in the murders? Was he a mere witness, or was he a more active participant in the events that led to the gruesome deaths of 5 men? As Nathan stood in front of the evidence board in the tribal police precinct, he couldn't help but feel the weight of every unanswered question pressing on him. Every name, every photograph, every clue seemed to lead him deeper into a tangled mess of secrets and lies. And at the center of it all was the terrifying possibility that the truth was much darker and more complicated than anyone had imagined. Despite his suspicions, Nathan couldn't afford to make assumptions. Wynn was a well-respected member of the tribal police force, someone who had been involved in law enforcement for years. But this wasn't just a case of a botched investigation or poor judgment. It was about betrayal and misguided loyalty. The people of Scawanati had trusted Wynn, and yet now, after learning of his involvement, Nathan had to decide whether Wynn's actions were those of a man overwhelmed by his conscience or someone with a far darker motivation. Nathan's investigation had already led him down a path where supernatural folklore and real-life criminal activity blurred into one. But Wynn's role in the entire affair was the missing piece to completing the puzzle. If Wynn knew something, he wasn't sharing it. If he was complicit, Nathan needed to know the truth before it was too late. The question of Wynn's involvement nagged at Nathan as he reviewed the details of the case with Chief Bearclaw. The chief, ever the enigma, remained tight-lipped about Wynn, though he had indicated that Wynn's actions during the investigation had been questionable. But was it simply a case of poor judgment, or something more sinister? Wynn has always been dependable, Chief. Bearclaw said, his voice low as he leaned over the desk to flip through the case file. But when I think about his connection to Harper to the river, well, it raises questions, doesn't it? Nathan nodded, taking in the chief's words. The chief was right. Wynn's history with Harper Clearwater, his unexplained actions during the investigation, and his apparent knowledge of the criminal activities in the area made him a prime suspect. but Nathan still wasn't sure how to approach him. His duty as a lawman demanded answers, but could Wynn provide them? Or would he remain hidden behind a wall of silence, unwilling to confess the truth? Nathan was caught between his instinct to push forward with the investigation and his growing sense of unease about how personal things had become. The tension in the precinct was palpable, and the deeper Nathan dug, the more layers of deception he uncovered. A tip had come in that Officer Wynn had been involved in more than just investigating the smuggling rings. According to sources, he had been at the scene of the murders, possibly even interacting with the victims before the bloodshed began. The idea of Wynn's involvement was both chilling and difficult to comprehend. A man who had sworn to protect the people of Scawanati, a man who had spent years earning the trust of the community, could he really be responsible for such brutality? Nathan's mind raced with possibilities, none of them pleasant. In an attempt to get answers, Nathan arranged to meet Wynn once again, but this time their conversation was going to be different. There would be no surface-level small talk, no pretense of camaraderie. This was an interrogation. Nathan couldn't afford to let Wynn's calm demeanor and years of service cloud his judgment. There was too much at stake, and if Wynn knew something about the murders, Nathan needed him to speak up. The community's future depended on it. When Wynn arrived at the precinct, he looked every bit the seasoned officer Nathan had come to expect, stoic, controlled, and professional. But there was something different this time, something in his eyes that Nathan hadn't seen before, a flicker of guilt, a touch of fear. It was subtle, but it was there. Wynn took a seat, and for the first time, Nathan could feel the walls between them begin to close in. "I know you were at the river that night." "Wynn?" Nathan began, his voice steady but firm. "I know you saw what happened. I need to hear it from you." Wynn didn't respond immediately, his gaze drifting toward the window as if searching for something beyond the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured, but Nathan could hear the strain in his words. "You don't know what it's like out there, Redfield. Not really. I was just trying to do my job, keep things under control. But when I saw what had happened to those men, I knew I couldn't just walk away." Nathan leaned forward. "You didn't walk away, but you didn't come forward either, did you?" "Why?" Wynn exhaled sharply, rubbing his hand over his face, as if trying to ward off the weight of his own conscience. "I didn't think anyone would believe me. Not with everything going on. Not with the history between us and the Bureau. When I saw those bodies, I knew I had to do something. But what no one here trusts the FBI, and I couldn't just sit by and let it happen. I was trying to protect the people Redfield, the people of Scawanati." Nathan's pulse quickened. He was hearing something that sounded close to a confession, but Wynn's words didn't add up. He had been trying to protect the community, but his silence had only made things worse. Nathan's instincts told him that Wynn wasn't being completely honest, but something in his tone rang true. There was a guilt in him, a conflict that was eating him from the inside. "You didn't protect anyone, Wynn. You may have thought you were, but your silence only put more lives in danger." Wynn dropped his head, the weight of his actions clearly bearing down on him. "I didn't know what else to do. I thought maybe if I stayed out of it, things would settle. But they didn't. And now I can't undo what I've done?" Nathan was silent for a long moment, processing Wynn's words. The man sitting before him wasn't the criminal he had imagined. He was a man tangled in his own mistakes, a man who had tried to walk a line between duty and loyalty and failed. "You don't have to do this alone," Nathan said softly. "We can fix this, but you have to help us. You have to tell the truth." Wynn nodded, the weight of his secrets heavy in the air between them. Nathan knew this was just the beginning. The investigation was far from over, but one thing was clear. The truth was more complicated than he had ever imagined, and the line between right and wrong wasn't always easy to see. Nathan had always prided himself on being a methodical investigator, one who could break down a case step by step, follow the evidence, and come to a logical conclusion. But as he stood at the edge of the Scawanati River, once again, his certainty began to waver. Officer Wynn had provided some much-needed clarity about his involvement that night, But there were still so many gaps, so many unanswered questions. Nathan had learned that the people of Scawanati were deeply tied to their land and history. And the further he dug into the case, the more he realized how little he truly understood about this community. The murders of the 5 men were just one part of the puzzle, but the connections between them and the community's long-standing grievances with outsiders, the FBI, and the cross-border smuggling rings were becoming more and more complicated. The file on the 5 victims, initially thought to be just another case of smuggling gone wrong, had grown thicker. What had seemed like a straightforward investigation had become something much deeper, something that went far beyond Nathan's initial understanding of the case. The ceremonial tobacco found in the mouths of the victims, the bizarre placement of the bodies, and now the mysterious symbols that had been painted on the trees near the river. All of it pointed to a disturbing pattern that Nathan couldn't yet decode. After the conversation with Wynne, Nathan felt the weight of the investigation pressing down on him more than ever. The river, the land, and the people of Scawanati weren't just passive elements in this case. They were active participants, each holding a piece of the puzzle, each contributing to the story. And yet, Nathan still felt like an outsider, like someone who had stumbled into a world that wasn't his own and was now forced to make sense of its rules. Even the local law enforcement, the tribal police, seemed divided. Some officers were willing to cooperate with him, but others, like Officer Wynne, were hiding their true feelings, unable to reconcile their personal connections to the community with their professional duties. And then there were the rumors, the stories of the river spirit, the beliefs that had been passed down for generations, warning that those who disrespected the land would face divine retribution. These stories were woven into the fabric of the case, but Nathan wasn't sure how much weight to give them. Were they simply myths, or was there something more to them? The more he heard, the less certain he became. It wasn't just the supernatural stories that rattled Nathan. It was the growing sense of injustice that permeated the entire investigation. This wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about healing deep wounds that had been left untouched for far too long. The FBI's failure to properly investigate Harper Clearwater's disappearance in 1966 had left a scar on the community, a scar that had festered over the years, leading to deep-seated mistrust of federal authorities. The disappearance of a young girl, followed by years of indifference, had not only ruined her family, but had also alienated an entire community. Nathan wasn't just trying to solve the murder of 5 men. He was trying to mend a broken relationship, trying to bridge the gap between the law and the people who had felt abandoned by it. As he looked over the case files in his motel room that night, the implications of everything he had learned began to sink in. Harper Clearwater's disappearance, the cross-border smuggling, the murder of the 5 men, and now Sarah Du Bois. The young girl who had barely survived this wasn't a simple case of violence. This was a ripple effect of pain, betrayal, and unresolved grief. Nathan realized that he wasn't just investigating a crime scene. He was uncovering the layers of a community's collective trauma, one that had been ignored for too long. Scawanati's people, the Mohawk community, had been silenced by years of neglect, and now the crimes they had been burdened with were starting to resurface. As Nathan sat in the dim light of his motel room, he thought about Jonas Clearwater, the father of the missing girl, and the intensity with which he had pursued his own investigation into the criminal networks operating on the reservation. Jonas had spent years chasing ghosts, unable to let go of the belief that his daughter had been taken, that something more sinister had happened to her. Nathan couldn't help but wonder, had Jonas's personal vendetta clouded his judgment, or had he been onto something all along? The more Nathan thought about it, the more he realized that Harper's disappearance was the root of everything that had happened. If the Bureau had done its job properly back in the 60s, perhaps none of this would have happened. Perhaps the chain of violence and betrayal could have been broken before it even started. In the days that followed, Nathan grew more determined. He was no longer just an outsider trying to piece together a case. He had become a part of the community's story. And as he worked alongside Chief Bearclaw, and the tribal police, he began to understand the deep connection between the people of Scawanati and their land, their beliefs, and their history. He started to realize that the law was not the only thing that mattered here. Justice was personal. It was about righting the wrongs of the past, healing the scars that had been left behind, and restoring the trust that had been shattered. The investigation had become something far larger than Nathan could have anticipated. The truth was no longer just about solving the murders. It was about understanding a community that had lived in the shadows for too long. And as Nathan prepared to dig deeper into the criminal organizations operating on the reservation, he realized that this case wasn't just about criminals. It was about people who had been wronged, people who had been ignored, and people who were now demanding to be heard. Nathan had spent weeks trying to piece together the mysteries surrounding the Scawanati River murders, but the discovery of the 3 dead children, 2 from Canada and 1 from the United States, had changed everything. The case had morphed from a series of isolated crimes into something much more complicated and unsettling. These were no ordinary victims. Their deaths were part of a much deeper pattern, one that stretched beyond the boundaries of law and order, touching on something far older, far darker. Nathan's first instinct was to follow the facts, but the more he learned, the more the line between reality and superstition seemed to blur. The mutilated bodies of the smugglers, the ceremonial tobacco in their mouths, and the strange symbols painted on nearby trees now made sense in ways Nathan hadn't expected. It wasn't just a drug deal gone wrong. This was about more than criminals. It was about justice and how the people of Scawanati defined it. The discovery of the children washed up on the banks of the river shook Nathan to his core. For weeks, he had been tracking the lives of smugglers, trying to uncover who was behind the human trafficking and drug smuggling that had plagued the region. The smugglers had been brutal. But these children, these innocent lives, were an entirely different matter. Their deaths couldn't be explained by anything he'd seen in his years of law enforcement. The children weren't caught in the crossfire of criminal activity. They had been deliberately murdered, and Nathan couldn't help but feel that they had become symbols of something far bigger, a sacrifice, a retribution, or maybe even a message. But from whom? And why Jonas Clearwater had warned him about the mysterious force of the river spirit. At first, Nathan had dismissed it as folklore, a cultural explanation for the inexplicable. But as the evidence mounted, ceremonial tobacco, the strange symbols, the belief in spiritual guardians, it became harder to deny that there was something more at play here than mere criminality. Nathan wasn't a believer in the supernatural, but after seeing the way the community reacted to the river's role in the killings, he began to wonder if there was some deeper truth to these ancient beliefs. It wasn't just about the smugglers or the missing children anymore. The land, the people, and their beliefs had all become part of the case. The more Nathan immersed himself in the investigation, the more he began to understand that Scawanati was a place defined not just by law, but by a history of grief, betrayal, and silence. The Mohawk people had been wronged by outsiders for generations, and while the FBI might have come to investigate the crimes, what was really needed was something far more personal: healing. The connection between the murders and the community's deep-rooted beliefs became undeniable after Nathan visited the site where the children had been found. The Scawanati River, which had once been a source of life for the people, now seemed like a force of destruction. It had taken the children just as it had claimed the lives of the smugglers. Some of the local tribal elders spoke of the river's ability to take the wrongdoers to exact justice on behalf of those who had been wronged by greed or disrespect. It was a justice that didn't rely on laws or courts, but on something older, something tied to the very soul of the land. This justice, however, was often harsh, unforgiving, and as Nathan soon learned, not always easily understood by those from the outside. One night, while going over the case files in his motel room, Nathan realized something disturbing. Jonas Clearwater's obsession with the case was not just about finding the perpetrators. Jonas had long believed that the FBI had failed him and his community. The disappearance of his daughter Harper had been dismissed as a runaway case, and the FBI hadn't bothered to follow up. Now, with the recent murders and the discovery of the children, Jonas saw a pattern that couldn't be ignored. The deaths weren't random, they were connected. And Jonas believed that these deaths were a warning from the spirit of the river. This was no longer just about tracking down a criminal organization. Nathan's understanding of the investigation had evolved into something far more complex. He wasn't just solving a crime, he was trying to understand a community's deeply held beliefs and how those beliefs were shaping the events unfolding before him. He was beginning to realize that he couldn't approach this case as he would any other. This wasn't just about following clues and catching criminals. This was about recognizing the pain the community had endured for decades, and how that pain was now manifesting in violence, mysticism, and retribution. The more Nathan thought about it, the more he understood that the 3 missing children weren't just victims of a failed drug deal. They were symbols, representations of the very innocence lost in the conflict between the Scawanati people and the outsiders who had taken advantage of them for so long. But even more disturbingly, they were sacrifices paying the price for a long-standing injustice, as if the river itself had demanded reparation for the wrongs that had been done to its people. Nathan's journey from a straightforward investigation into a series of murders to an exploration of cultural retribution and the moral ambiguities of justice had forced him to confront the deep divides between the law he knew and the world he had entered. This case was not just about solving a crime. It was about understanding the pain and resilience of a people who had been pushed to the edge. As Nathan prepared for the next steps in the investigation, he understood that the resolution of this case would not come from conventional methods. It would come from recognizing the truth in the past and the community's call for justice. Jonas Red Elk had lived his entire life on the Tohi Valley Indian Reservation, a land nestled near the towering presence of Mount Rainier. Born into a lineage of hunters, healers, and storytellers, he carried the weight of both pride and sorrow, passed down through generations. The reservation, rich in natural beauty and cultural heritage, was also marked by struggle, a place where hope often wrestled with hardship. From a young age, Jonas understood the dual nature of his home, but there was one story seared into his memory since childhood that would come to define his understanding of loss, resilience, and community. The Tohi Valley Reservation, where Jonas Red Elk was born and raised, stretches across miles of forested ridges and misty foothills near Mount Rainier. The land is breathtaking, towering pines, clear-running creeks, and crimson sunsets that seem to set the entire sky ablaze. Tourists passing through might see only beauty, but for those like Jonas, the valley holds deeper truths. The silence of the woods often hides pain, abandoned homes, broken families, and lives worn down by unseen battles. To outsiders, it's a place of postcard perfection. To Jonas, it's home sacred but scarred. The story he carries, the one that marked his childhood, was born here, shaped by both the land's serenity and the shadows creeping just beyond its tree line. While the natural beauty of Tohi Valley remained timeless, the people living there had not been spared from modern plagues. The most devastating among them was methamphetamine. For decades, it crept into homes like a slow poison, unraveling families and fraying the fabric of community life. Jonas Red Elk had seen the damage firsthand. Friends who'd once shared fishing trips or laughed at school assemblies now wandered the streets hollow-eyed and twitching, lost in the grip of addiction. The drug didn't just destroy individuals, it corroded trust, safety, and the hope of future generations. Children were left to fend for themselves, elders locked their doors earlier, and entire households vanished behind boarded windows. Meth wasn't just a crime issue, it was a community crisis that twisted love into suspicion and turned neighbors into ghosts. For Jonas, the presence of the drug wasn't abstract. It had stolen voices he'd grown up hearing and dimmed lights he once believed would never fade. That slow decay set the stage for something even darker, something that would shake the valley's spirit and leave a scar no healing ceremony could fully erase. In the midst of that growing darkness, Clara Rain was a rare and steady light. A beloved elementary school teacher in Tohi Valley, she lived alone in a modest cedar cabin at the edge of the woods where the forest met the first rows of town. Clara was known not just for her soft-spoken wisdom and warm smile, but for her fierce belief in the potential of every child. She often brought homemade fry bread to class, stayed after hours to tutor struggling students, and volunteered at nearly every tribal event. For many in the community, her classroom was a safe haven, one of the few places where children could feel hope instead of fear. She was more than a teacher. She was a lifeline, a symbol of what the reservation could still be. As meth pulled others down, Clara seemed untouched by its shadow. But even the brightest flames can be snuffed out. No one, not even Jonas, could have imagined that her light would be extinguished in a way so brutal it would change Tohi Valley forever. One man who had once known Clara Rain was Dale Two Rivers. Years before, he'd been a skilled hunter and a dependable presence at tribal ceremonies. But meth had hollowed him out, leaving behind only a shell of the man he used to be. By the time Jonas was in high school, Dale was already known more for his erratic behavior and wild eyes than any past accomplishments. He'd cycle through brief stints in rehab, only to relapse harder each time. Locals had learned to keep their distance when Dale was in one of his spirals, wandering barefoot, mumbling about spirits convinced the trees were watching him. It wasn't hatred that kept people away. It was fear and heartbreak. Dale had become a living warning of what meth could do, not just to the body, but to the soul. Still, no one could have predicted what he would do next, or how his path would collide so violently with Clara Rain's gentle light. It happened on a cold autumn night, the kind where the fog hangs low and the pine trees seem to whisper. Dale Two Rivers, deep in a meth-induced psychosis, left his trailer barefoot and shirtless, rambling to no one in particular. Witnesses would later say they saw him pacing near the outskirts of town, muttering about being hunted by shadows. But the next person he encountered wasn't a hallucination. It was Clara Rain. Her cabin, nestled just beyond the last gravel road, was the first house he stumbled upon. What followed was so horrifying that even law enforcement officers struggled to talk about it later. Dale broke in raving and delusional and brutally murdered Clara. But it didn't stop there. In some twisted logic, only his drug-warped mind could comprehend. He believed that consuming part of her body would cleanse his soul. That was what he reportedly told police after his arrest, though he barely seemed aware of where he was. The next morning, when Clara didn't show up for school, neighbors checked in. What they found inside was a scene straight out of a nightmare. Jonas never forgot the sirens, the yellow tape, or the sound of his mother weeping on the porch. Clara Rain's death sent shockwaves through the Tohi Valley Reservation. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime, it was the loss of someone who had meant so much to so many. For weeks, the community seemed frozen in collective grief. Schoolchildren carried handmade drawings to the fence outside her cabin. Elders led candlelight vigils, and families who hadn't spoken in years sat together in silence at tribal meetings. Fear settled over the town like a low cloud. But so did a burning question. How had it come to this? Clara had been taken not just by one man, but by a system of neglect, addiction, and silence that had gone unchecked too long. The tragedy stirred something deeper, a desire for change. Jonas remembered hearing voices at the tribal council, not filled with blame but with urgency. They weren't just mourning Clara, they were waking up to the cost of inaction. From that grief, slow but steady action began to take root. With funding from tribal grants and donations, the community opened the Tohi Flame Recovery Center, a place where those struggling with addiction could find counseling, cultural reconnection, and a path toward healing. volunteers formed a neighborhood group called Guardians of the Light, watching out for vulnerable youth and checking in on isolated elders. Traditional healing ceremonies returned, led by tribal elders who spoke of resilience passed down through generations. Schools started offering drug education that went beyond scare tactics, focusing instead on identity, purpose, and community strength. Jonas saw change not as a tidal wave, but as ripples, gentle and persistent. And through those ripples, Clara Rain's memory became more than a tragedy. It became a movement. Even now, years later, Jonas Red Elk still pauses when passing Clara Rain's old cabin, its windows boarded, its garden overgrown. He doesn't see a crime scene. He sees a reminder of what's worth protecting. Her memory lives on in every child who walks through the doors of the Tohi Flame Center, in every vigil held under starlit skies. Clara's light didn't vanish, it passed hands. And Jonas, like many in Tohi Valley, carries it forward with quiet, unwavering purpose. Tomas Begay, a 27-year-old Navajo man, was born and raised in Saydacan, a quiet Red Rock reservation nestled near the Arizona-New Mexico border. Known for his deep bond with the land and his loyal dog, Kashi Tomas, often found peace in nature's silence. His childhood friend, Dr. Elijah Nez, a PhD ecologist and environmental justice advocate, had always blended science with cultural heritage. Together, they would soon confront a threat neither tradition nor training had ever prepared them for. Saydakaan, meaning between the red stones, was more than home to Tomas. It was a living memory. The reservation stretched across sun-scorched mesas and sandstone cliffs, with narrow canyons carved by time and monsoon rains. At its heart flowed Chiji Creek, a spring-fed stream so clear it once mirrored the sky. Families gathered there for stories, blessings, and rest. For Tomas and Kashi, it was sacred ground, a place of stillness, beauty, and trust. Until the day that trust was broken. One late afternoon in early spring, Tomas and Kashi took their usual walk along the edge of Chishi Creek. The air was dry and sweet, with the scent of sagebrush, but something felt off. As they approached the water, Tomas froze. The creek, normally crystal clear, had turned a cloudy, unnatural green. An oily film shimmered on the surface, reflecting the sun in sickly hues. Before Tomas could react, Kashi darted forward and lapped at the water. He called her back instantly, but the damage, silent and invisible, had already begun. Over the next few days, Kashi's behavior changed in ways Tomas couldn't explain. The once affectionate, even-tempered dog became restless, pacing the floor and growling at nothing. She avoided Tomas's touch. Her eyes wild with something between fear and rage. She snapped at shadows and barked into corners, as if seeing things no one else could. Tomas stayed up late, trying to soothe her, but nothing worked. On the fourth night, she lay down beside the door and never got up again. The silence in the house was suffocating. For Tomas, losing Kashi wasn't just losing a pet, it was losing a piece of himself. Her sudden decline felt unnatural, too sharp and eerie to ignore. That grief would become the spark for something bigger than either of them, a call to investigate what had gone wrong. Stricken with grief and searching for answers, Tomas called Elijah Nez. The seasoned ecologist arrived the next day with his mobile testing kit and calm, observant presence. They returned to Chiji Creek in full daylight, and what they found was worse than before. The oily sheen was thicker, the stench more pronounced. Elijah took water samples and ran preliminary tests back at Tomas's home. The results were disturbing high levels of neurotoxic chemicals not naturally found in the region. Elijah's voice was steady, but his eyes said everything. This wasn't just pollution. It was deliberate contamination with dangerous consequences. Determined to uncover the source, Tomas and Elijah set up a watch near the creek under the cover of night. Armed with a camera, notepads, and quiet resolve, they waited beneath the twisted limbs of an old cottonwood. Around 11:45 p.m., Headlights flickered through the brush. A flatbed truck crept along the dirt road, its engine barely humming. Two figures in dark clothing stepped out, rolled heavy barrels to the creek, and began pouring their contents into the water. Tomas felt his chest tighten with disbelief and anger. Elijah, methodical as ever, documented every movement, every sound. They stayed hidden, holding their breath, until the truck vanished into the dark. What they'd witnessed wasn't an accident or negligence, it was a crime. And they now held the evidence that could expose it. The next morning, Tomas and Elijah brought their findings to the Teda Ka'an Tribal Council. At first, the council members reacted with disbelief. No one wanted to believe such a violation could occur, so close to home. But Elijah's scientific data, paired with Tomas's first-hand account and photographic evidence, made denial impossible. Other residents soon came forward reporting similar changes in animal behavior and strange smells near the creek. The weight of truth sank in. Realizing the threat to both land and people, the council acted swiftly, filing a formal complaint and contacting the Environmental Protection Agency. What began as a quiet observation had now become a community alarm, and the people of Seda Ka'an were ready to fight for their water, their health, and their future. Within days, EPA officials arrived on site, collecting samples and interviewing witnesses. Their tests confirmed what Elijah had suspected: the creek was contaminated with hazardous industrial waste chemicals capable of causing neurological damage, aggressive behavior in animals, and long-term health issues in humans. The source was traced to a nearby corporation illegally dumping waste under the radar. Legal action followed swiftly. The company was fined heavily and ordered to fund a comprehensive cleanup. But cleanup wouldn't happen overnight. For months, the community relied on water deliveries and rainwater collection. Everyday life was disrupted, and trust in the land was shaken. Still, the people of Seda Ka'an adapted. They leaned on each other, forming water-sharing networks and support circles. What could have broken them instead began to unite them around a common cause: restoring what was nearly lost. In the months that followed, Elijah chose to stay close, not only to assist with recovery efforts, but to empower the community. He organized workshops that blended traditional Navajo ecological knowledge with modern environmental science. Elders shared stories of land stewardship, while youth learned to test water quality and recognize early warning signs. Together, they formed a community-led environmental safety committee trained to monitor the creek and surrounding areas. What began as a crisis transformed into a movement of education, resilience, and pride. The people of Seda Ka'an were no longer just victims, they had become guardians of their land. Now when Thomas walks the familiar path along Chiji Creek, the water flows clear, once more reflecting the sky as it once did. The loss of Kashi still lingers, a quiet ache beneath the progress, but it fuels his commitment to vigilance. That creek, once a place of peace and then of pain, now stands as a symbol of community strength. Tomas often pauses at the spot where Kashi last drank, not in sorrow, but with renewed purpose. Protecting their land isn't just about survival, it's about honoring memory, reclaiming dignity, and living with respect on their own terms. And so, from tragedy, came transformation. What began with the quiet loss of a beloved dog became a powerful reminder that silence can be dangerous, but action can heal. The people of Seda Ka'an now walk their land with clearer eyes and stronger voices, knowing that true stewardship means never looking away. The creek runs clean, the wind carries stories again, and Tomas, like his community, remains watchful, rooted, and ready to defend the sacred ground they call home. Hey friends, thanks so much for listening. Tap that notification bell, hit like and subscribe to keep these powerful stories flowing. Every time you support the channel, you help bring forgotten voices back into the light. And trust me, there's so much more to uncover. Stick around. The next story might just change the way you see the world.